"Something is wrong with the evidence room," investigator Kalen Dreth said, and the clerk behind the intake window looked at him with the polite, practiced vacancy of someone who had processed 1,100 case files that quarter and intended to process 1,100 more without incident. "Could you specify the nature of the discrepancy, investigator?" "No," Kalen set his datapad on the counter. The morning light from the atrium's upper gallery fell across his hands, six-fingered, gray-blue, steady as surgical instruments. "That is the problem. I cannot specify it because the discrepancy is in my own memory." The clerk blinked twice, a slow lateral sweep of translucent inner lids, and said nothing. Kalen picked up the pad and walked back toward the evidence wing. Behind him, the clerk quietly flagged the interaction log with a notation that would later prove significant. Investigator Dreth, self-reported cognitive anomaly, 0914 local. The Etched judiciary complex sat on the daylit plateau of Veen Reach, a city built from white composite and engineered glass on a world where the sun lingered 19 hours per rotation. The building's interior was flooded with natural light channeled through prismatic ceiling panels, every corridor bright and sharp-edged, every surface designed to eliminate shadow. The Etched believed that justice required clarity, and clarity required illumination. Metaphor made architecture. Kalen had worked in this building for 16 years. He knew the angle of the light in every corridor at every hour of the 19-hour day. The way it shifted from sharp white in the early hours to a faintly warmer tone as the sun crossed the building's eastern prismatic array and entered the western panels at a lower angle. He knew the sound of his own footsteps on the polished stone floors, the specific resonance they produced against composite walls built thicker than structural necessity demanded, because the Etched constructed their judicial institutions to outlast generations, and considered the acoustic weight of a building to be a measure of the seriousness with which the institution took its own function. He knew who he was. He had always known who he was. That certainty, the bedrock solidity of self-knowledge, the absolute fixed point around which everything else could be interrogated and doubted and tested, was the foundation on which every investigation he had ever conducted had been constructed. A Etched investigator was trained to doubt everything external: witness testimony, forensic data, surveillance records, the conclusions of other investigators, the coherence of motive, the reliability of confession. But the internal architecture of the investigator's own mind was treated as fixed ground. You doubted the world. You did not doubt the instrument doing the doubting. Until this morning, when he had opened the sealed evidence container for case 3371 Ven, and found, sitting on the shelf where a catalogued biological sample should have been, a small glass jar containing a single human tooth. The tooth was not in the evidence manifest. It had never been logged. No chain of custody tag was attached. The jar itself was unmarked, plain laboratory glass, sealed with a friction-fit cap, the kind of container available from any standard forensic supply catalog across 40 systems. Inside, resting on a small square of white absorbent cloth, the tooth sat with the casual, unremarkable stillness of an object that had been exactly where it was for a very long time. Kalen had reached for it. His hand had stopped. Not because of protocol, although protocol demanded that unlogged evidence be reported before handling, but because the moment his fingers approached the jar, something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker. Less than a thought, more than a reflex. The specific, unsettling sensation of almost remembering something that he was simultaneously certain he had never experienced. He had pulled his hand back and stood motionless in the evidence room for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, staring at a tooth in a jar, while the daylight from the corridor behind him painted his shadow long and thin across the polished floor. Now he was walking back. He had reported the anomaly. He had followed procedure. And the feeling had not gone away. It sat behind his thoughts like a word caught between languages, something known and forgotten in the same instant, refusing to resolve in either direction. The evidence room door was sealed. His biometric access log showed entry at 0831, exit at 0835. The environmental controls registered no secondary entry during the interval. The surveillance feed, which he pulled on his datapad while standing outside, showed an empty room from the moment he had left to this moment. The jar visible on its shelf in the bright overhead light, the tooth a pale dot against the white cloth. He entered, the jar was on the shelf, the tooth was in the jar. Kalen put on forensic handling gloves, thin, translucent, tight across his 6 fingers, and lifted the container. It weighed almost nothing. The tooth inside was small, a human premolar, he estimated, though his xenodental knowledge extended no further than the identification charts in the consulting wing's reference library. It was clean. No visible decay, no discoloration beyond the natural ivory yellow of healthy enamel. A tooth that had been extracted, not broken, removed with clinical precision, the root intact, smooth, and undamaged. He turned the jar slowly in the evidence room's bright overhead light. The glass was unremarkable. The cap was unremarkable. The cloth square was unremarkable. Everything about the object was specifically, deliberately, aggressively ordinary, the kind of ordinary that, in 16 years of investigative work, Kalen had learned to distrust more deeply than any dramatic anomaly. Dramatic anomalies announced themselves. Ordinary things that did not belong sat quietly and waited to be overlooked. Something caught the light. On the inner surface of the glass near the base where the cloth square met the curved wall of the jar, a mark, not a scratch, not a manufacturing defect, a single character etched into the glass with something fine-pointed and precise, tertiary script, one glyph. Kalen read it, and the floor shifted under him. The glyph was his own case mark, the personal identification symbol that every tertiary investigator chose upon certification and used to initial evidence tags, close case files, and authenticate forensic chains of custody. His case mark, unmistakable, the specific arrangement of angles and curves that he had chosen 16 years ago and had written thousands of times since, in every file, on every tag, across every case he had ever worked. Etched into the inside of a glass jar that he had never seen before this morning, containing a tooth that had never been logged, sitting on a shelf in a sealed evidence container where it had no documented reason to be. He set the jar down, carefully. His hands did not tremble. His training held 16 years of discipline, of learning to observe without reacting, to catalog without concluding, to let evidence speak before the investigator interpreted. But beneath the procedural composure, something fundamental was recalibrating. The investigative mind encountering evidence that pointed inward instead of outward. A compass needle swinging toward the hand that held it. He photographed the jar from 7 angles. He recorded the glyph with the datapad's microscopic imaging function. He documented the shelf position, the container seal integrity, the environmental readings. He did everything that procedure demanded, and when he was finished, he stood in the bright evidence room and asked himself, very quietly, who had put it there. The answer that pressed against the back of his mind, the one the glyph implied, the one the almost memory suggested, the one that his training was working very hard to hold at arm's length until evidence confirmed or denied it, was that he had. The human had arrived on Veen Reach 14 months earlier. Kalen reconstructed the intake sequence from records rather than memory, because his memory had become the thing under investigation, and he no longer trusted it to provide uncontaminated data. The record said, Sable Kincaid, consulting forensic specialist, assigned under the Interspecies Expertise Exchange. Credentials verified through automated protocol against a Human Forensic Institute's registry. Workstation assigned in the consulting wing, West Corridor. Restricted Evidence Archive access granted at clearance level C2. Standard orientation package for non-tertiary judicial personnel completed, signed, and filed. Humans were not common in tertiary judicial space, but the judiciary had reluctantly accepted the exchange program after 3 high-profile cases involving human-adjacent biological evidence had been compromised by investigators who did not understand mammalian biology. The program's logic was sound. Some evidence required the perspective of the species it came from. The tertiary had accepted this the way they accepted all externally imposed necessities, with formal compliance and private reservations recorded in memoranda that were archived but never acted upon. Sable Kincaid had been working in the building for 14 months. Kalen's personal case log, every investigation he had led, every consultation request filed, every evidence review conducted with external specialists, contained her name exactly 0 times. He had discovered this 3 days ago, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the quiet, persistent itch of a question he could not stop turning over. When had he last spoken with her? The question should have been trivial. He could picture her face, square jaw, dark eyes, dark hair pulled tight at the base of the skull, the compact solidity of build that humans developed when their professions required decades of physical precision work. He could hear the approximate timbre of her voice. He was certain, with the specific granular certainty that investigative training was designed to produce, that he had spoken with her many times, in corridors, in the atrium during the midday meal cycle, at the consulting wing's shared data terminal where external specialists queued research requests. But when he tried to locate a specific moment, a specific conversation, a specific case consultation, a specific exchange of words in a specific corridor on a specific date, the memory dissolved, not into blankness, into something worse, a vague, warm, featureless sense of familiarity that felt less like recollection and more like description. As though someone had carefully told him about meeting Sable Kincaid in convincing and plausible detail, and his mind had filed the telling in the same architecture where genuine memories lived, and the two had become indistinguishable. That discovery had changed the texture of his days. Not visibly, he continued to work, to file, to investigate, to walk the bright corridors and eat in the atrium and sleep in his quarters 3 blocks from the judiciary. But internally, a new layer had been added to every thought, the constant, low-grade awareness that his own mental record might not be reliable, that the instrument he used to evaluate all other evidence, his trained, certified, 16-year seasoned investigative mind, might itself contain evidence that had been planted. The feeling was not panic. It was something quieter, more corrosive. The slow recognition that the ground you have been standing on is not bedrock but sediment, packed firm enough to feel solid, soft enough to shift. He had gone through the exercise of examining his recent case decisions. Case 4401 Thren, a procurement fraud investigation he had closed 3 weeks ago. Had the evidence genuinely supported the conclusion, or had he been nudged toward a reading that someone needed him to reach? Case 3892 Orvan, a corruption inquiry he had deprioritized 6 weeks ago after concluding that the initial complaint lacked sufficient evidentiary foundation. Had that conclusion been his own assessment, or had his assessment been shaped by a softened memory of evidence that had, at some point, been more compelling than he now remembered it being? Each question opened another question. Each re-examination produced not clarity but a deeper layer of the same corrosive uncertainty, because the instrument he was using to re-examine his decisions was the same instrument that might have been compromised when the decisions were originally made. He was auditing his own audit system, using the audit system as the tool. The recursion was perfect and perfectly useless. The tooth had made it worse. And better. Worse because it was physical proof that something had happened outside his memory's jurisdiction, something involving his own case mark, his own evidence container, his own sealed biometric access. Better because it was physical proof. Period. The jar existed. The glyph existed. The tooth, hard, mineral, unchanged by time or perception or the slow tidal drift of recollection, existed in a way that memory, by its biological nature, could not. It sat on the shelf, and it did not flicker, and it did not dissolve, and it did not feel like a description of itself. It simply was. He left the evidence room, sealed the door behind him, and walked to the consulting wing. The corridor between the evidence wing and the consulting section ran along the building's central axis. 70 meters of polished composite floored in pale stone quarried from the Veen Reach Plateau itself. Kalen walked it slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because his investigative instincts were active, and those instincts demanded that he observe the space around him with the heightened attention of someone who had just discovered that his environment might contain systems designed to modify his perception of reality. The environmental panels along the ceiling were standard, prismatic daylight diffusers, atmospheric regulation vents, acoustic dampening grids. He had walked past them every working day for 16 years without giving them conscious attention. Now he looked at them the way he looked at a crime scene, as a collection of surfaces that might be concealing function behind familiarity. Behind one of those acoustic grids, or embedded in the atmospheric vents, or integrated into the electromagnetic shielding that lined the walls of every evidence-sensitive corridor in the building, the ENV 7741 subsystem was operating, right now, around him. Invisible, inaudible, producing neural resonance patterns that his own biology was not equipped to detect, and that his training had never taught him to look for, because the possibility that the building itself might be a cognitive weapon had not been part of any tertiary investigator's training curriculum. He wondered how many times he had walked this corridor in the past 4 months while the system worked on him. How many times the resonance had pulsed through the walls and touched the architecture of his certainty and softened it by another fraction of a degree, while he continued walking and thinking and investigating, unaware that the instrument was being recalibrated in real time by hands he could not see. The thought was not paranoid. It was procedural. It was the specific, trained habit of an investigator reconstructing a timeline of events. Except in this case, the events had occurred inside his own skull, and the timeline was a record of his own diminishment. He reached the consulting wing entrance and paused. Through the glass partition, he could see Sable Kincaid at her terminal, the human specialist, the immune witness, the other end of a bridge that a version of himself he could no longer remember had built across a gap he had not known was coming. Sable Kincaid was at her workstation. The consulting wing was bright, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the plateau, the 19-hour sun pouring through unfiltered glass, throwing long rectangles of white light across the composite floor. She was seated at her terminal, her back to the door, reading something on her screen with the focused stillness of someone who expected to be interrupted and was using the remaining seconds efficiently. She did not turn when Kalen entered. "Investigator Dreth," she said, not a question, not a greeting. A confirmation. "Ms. Kincaid." He stopped 3 paces from her workstation. Professional distance, close enough for observation, far enough for objectivity. Interrogation geometry, trained into his body across hundreds of interviews until it was as automatic as the spacing of his own vertebrae. "You found it," she said, still facing the screen. "I found an unlogged biological sample in a sealed evidence container assigned to one of my cases. The sample bears my case mark on its interior surface. I have no record of placing it there, no memory of the sample's origin, and no explanation for why my personal identification symbol is etched into the glass. And you came here. You are the only human forensic specialist in this building. The sample is a human tooth." She turned in her chair. Her face was composed, the particular quality of human composure that Kalen had observed in other humans during high-stress professional interactions. Not relaxation, not indifference, a deliberate conservation of expression, the facial equivalent of speaking in a controlled register while the internal state ran at a different frequency entirely. Humans managed their faces the way the tertii managed their voice harmonics, consciously, with effort, and never quite well enough to deceive a trained observer who knew what to look for. He could see the tension in the fine muscles around her eyes, the orbicularis oculi, the corrugator, holding steady against an expression that wanted to be something other than neutral. "Sit down, investigator." He did not sit. "I would prefer to stand." "I know you would. You said exactly the same thing 7 months ago." The sentence landed like a handprint on frosted glass, visible, foreign, specific. 7 months ago. A date, a context, a reference to a version of this conversation that he could not access but that she apparently could. The number landed, 7 months, and Kalen felt something shift in the space behind his analytical mind. Not a memory returning. Something smaller and less useful. The awareness that 7 months ago, in this room, possibly in this exact configuration of light and furniture and professional distance, a version of himself that he could no longer access had stood in this same geometry, and said the same words and made decisions whose consequences had led directly to this moment. That version had possessed what this version had lost: the uncompromised certainty, the clean calibration, the ability to trust his own findings without the constant low hum of doubt that now accompanied every conclusion like static on a frequency that should have been clear. She reached into the drawer of her workstation and withdrew a data chip, standard tertii judicial format, the archival type used for case records stored outside the active database. She placed it on the edge of the desk, centered precisely in the rectangle of sunlight falling from the window. The chip caught the light and held it, a small bright point on the white composite surface. "You will want to review this before we continue." He took the chip, inserted it into his datapad. The screen populated with a case file, bearing his case number, his authentication codes, his investigative notes, his notation conventions. Case 3371 Ven. But this version was longer, 47 pages longer. The additional material was typed in his own shorthand, his abbreviations. His methodology: physical findings first, contextual analysis second, witness correlation third, working hypothesis last. The sequence he had developed over 16 years, never formally documented because it lived in his investigative habits rather than in any training manual. The word choices were his. The sentence cadences were his. The specific way he indented subsections and used dash marks to separate evidentiary chains, all his, as distinctive as a voice print, as personal as a case mark. The additional 47 pages described an investigation he did not remember conducting. He scrolled through the pages slowly. His investigative training, the part of him that still functioned with mechanical reliability regardless of what had been done to the substrate it ran on, noted the quality of the work. The documentation was thorough. The evidence chains were clean. Each assertion was supported by at least 2 independent data sources, cross-referenced against a third, and annotated with the specific retrieval method used to obtain it. The writing was clear, precise, economical, the prose of an investigator who had been doing this work long enough that the discipline was embedded in the sentence structure itself, the way a carpenter's experience is visible in the grain of a joint. It was, objectively, excellent investigative work. The kind of work that Kalen would have been proud of, if pride were a feeling his damaged certainty could still produce without the accompanying whisper of "but is it really yours?" He read his own investigation the way an amnesiac might read a diary written in his own handwriting, recognizing the hand, believing the provenance, unable to access the experience that had produced the words. The investigation concerned systematic corruption in the tertii judiciary's evidence processing chain. Specifically, the targeted insertion of fabricated evidence into sealed containers, accompanied by corresponding modifications to the memories of the investigators assigned to those cases. The fabricated evidence was always minor: a fiber sample that placed a suspect at a scene, a chemical trace that shifted a timeline, a biological fragment that introduced a false identification lead, never dramatic enough to trigger secondary review, always subtle enough to redirect a case's trajectory by a few degrees without any single alteration appearing significant on its own. The memory modifications were equally precise, not the wholesale implantation of false experiences, but the systematic, gradual erosion of certainty around real ones, the introduction of vagueness, the softening of edges. The slow conversion of "I know this" into "I think I recall something like this." A process so incremental that the investigator experiencing it could not identify the moment when knowledge became impression and impression became doubt. The method was documented in careful, clinical detail. The technology was identified: a cognitive influence system originally developed by the Tertiary Ministry of Rehabilitation for therapeutic use in trauma recovery, the controlled softening of acute distress memories in patients with post-crisis psychological damage. The system operated through targeted neural resonance patterns delivered via the judiciary building's own ambient environmental infrastructure, the same systems that maintained temperature, humidity, and interior lighting throughout the complex. The resonance patterns were subsonic, invisible, and unfelt. They worked across weeks, not hours. They nudged specific memory formations toward reduced consolidation, diminishing the neurological strength of the connection between an experience and the sense of having experienced it. The memory remained. The certainty that the memory was real diminished. The file named the operators, tertiary names. Names Kalin recognized as he read them. Colleagues he had shared case consultations with, supervisors who had reviewed his work, senior judicial officials whose continued authority depended on specific case outcomes remaining undisturbed. Each name was supported by evidence: access logs for the environmental control systems, resonance pattern scheduling records cross-referenced with investigator shift assignments, internal communications obtained through methods the file documented in meticulous procedural detail. And at the bottom of the 47 additional pages, in notation that was unmistakably his own, was a single line: "If you are reading this and do not remember writing it, they have already used it on you. The tooth is your anchor. You put it there because teeth do not change and memories do." Kalin read the line 3 times. Each reading carried the same weight. The words did not become more familiar. They did not trigger a cascade of returning memories or a sudden cinematic rush of clarity. They sat on the screen with the same mute, factual stillness as the tooth sat in the jar, offering no comfort, no reassurance, no narrative of vindication. Just information. Just the hard, mineral truth of what had been done, and what he had done in response before the capacity to remember doing it was taken from him. "How long?" he said. His voice was level, an investigator asking a diagnostic question the way he had asked thousands of them across 16 years. The question he wanted to ask, the one that pressed against the inside of his skull like a fractured line in load-bearing stone, was different and larger, and did not have edges he could speak around. 14 months. Sable Kincaid's voice was quiet, not gentle. She was not the kind of human who softened difficult information, and Kalin respected that, or remembered respecting it, or believed he remembered respecting it, and the layered uncertainty of that thought was itself a symptom of the thing she was about to describe. "You identified the pattern 7 months ago. Your investigation had been running quietly for 3 months before that, off-book, using methods you designed specifically to avoid triggering the monitoring protocols you knew were compromised. You brought me in because the manipulation system is tertiary designed and operates through neural resonance patterns calibrated to tertiary-specific cognitive architecture. Human neural structure is different at the foundational level. The resonance patterns slide off human cognition the way sound slides off a vacuum. There is nothing for them to interact with. You knew that. You recruited me specifically because my mind was the one surface in this building they could not rewrite. And then they used it on me. Sometime in the last 4 months, your investigation was advancing toward the operators, the senior officials, the file names. You were assembling the filing package for capital charges. They could not fabricate counter-evidence against you because you had designed your documentation protocols specifically to resist fabrication. You kept the most critical material on physical media stored outside the building's network. You maintained independent verification through me, a witness whose testimony could not be softened because my neural architecture could not receive the resonance patterns. So they went after the only target they had left. The investigator. The investigator's certainty. They did not erase your memories. That would have left gaps, detectable absences, missing time blocks, the cognitive equivalent of holes punched in a document. Your own training would have caught it within days. Instead, they softened. They reduced the consolidation strength of specific memories over a period of weeks. They took each recollection of the investigation, each conversation with me, each evidence review, each moment of analytical certainty, and they lowered its resolution. Gradually, fractionally, each week a little less sharp than the last, until your own case notes read like someone else's handwriting, and your own investigation felt like a story someone had told you about a person who might have been you. The words arrived with a weight that settled in the center of Kalen's chest and stayed there. Not surprise, the file had already conveyed the facts. Something deeper, the visceral recognition that the thing being described was not hypothetical. It was not a threat. It was not a future possibility to be guarded against. It was a completed action. It had already happened. It had happened to him. The doubt he felt right now in this bright room, holding this datapad, the nagging, corrosive uncertainty about whether his own work was genuine, was not the natural product of cautious analysis. It was an installed feature, a manufactured artifact. A weapon, lodged in the tissue of his cognition by the same people his investigation targeted, using the same system his investigation documented. And the worst part, the part that made the weight in his chest settle deeper, was that knowing it was manufactured did not make it feel manufactured. It felt exactly like doubt. It felt exactly like the reasonable, professional, investigatively appropriate uncertainty that his training had spent 16 years teaching him to cultivate. It wore the same clothes. It spoke in the same register. It sat in exactly the same place in his cognitive architecture where legitimate doubt was supposed to sit, and it was indistinguishable from the real thing by every internal metric he possessed. His own case mark was etched into the glass of the jar. His own tooth sat on the shelf in the evidence room behind him. The realization arrived not as a revelation but as a pressure change. The tooth was his, not a stranger's, not a collected forensic specimen from an unrelated case. His own premolar, extracted by his own arrangement from his own jaw, placed in the jar by his own hand, etched with his own symbol, sealed in the evidence container under his own biometric lock. A piece of his body, separated from the rest of him and preserved as an anchor point, a physical object that could not be softened, could not be blurred, could not be made to feel like a vague impression of itself. A fragment of the investigator placed beyond the reach of the weapon being used against the investigator, sitting in the evidence room with the mineral patience of something that had never possessed a memory and therefore could never have one degraded. He had left himself a message in the only medium that could not be edited. The investigation, he said, the names in this file, the operators, the evidence supporting the charges, is any of it still valid, accurate, real? She met his eyes. Humans had a quality in their gaze that the Tertiary found unsettling, a directional intensity, a focal pressure, as though the act of looking was itself a form of physical contact. Kalen held the gaze. He had learned during 14 months of proximity to hold it, or he believed he had learned, or he had been given the impression of learning, and the recursive uncertainty of the thought left a taste in the back of his mouth like corroded metal. "That is the question they wanted you to ask," Sable said. "That is the entire architecture of what they did. They did not need to destroy the evidence. You kept the physical copies beyond their reach. They did not need to eliminate witnesses. The file documents everything through independent channels. They just needed to make you uncertain enough to question whether your own work was real. Because a tertiary investigator who is questioning his own cognitive integrity is an investigator who has already been neutralized." The word landed in the bright room with the weight of stone. He had seen it happen to others. 3 investigators in his 16-year career had been formally classified as neutralized, removed from active casework, reassigned to administrative functions, their certification suspended pending cognitive evaluation. In each case, the official cause had been cognitive fatigue or stress-related perceptual degradation. In each case, the investigator in question had been working a sensitive case involving senior judicial personnel. In each case, the investigator had accepted the diagnosis and the reassignment with the quiet, defeated compliance of someone who no longer trusted their own ability to challenge the assessment. Kalen had observed these cases from the outside and had felt, in the professional, detached way that investigators feel about the misfortunes of colleagues, a measure of sympathy tempered by the private conviction that it could not happen to him. His mind was disciplined. His methodology was sound. His certainty was earned. That conviction, that specific, private, foundational arrogance about the reliability of his own instrument, was precisely the vulnerability the operators had exploited. They had not attacked his certainty directly. They had let it stand, monolithic and unquestioned, while they tunneled beneath it. Neutralized, the professional term for an investigator removed from effective function, not through termination, not through reassignment, not through any action that would generate a record or require justification. Through the introduction of doubt into the one system, an investigator was trained never to doubt. The self, the instrument, the foundation. He stood in the consulting wing with the datapad in his hand and the sun on the floor and the tooth in its jar 30 meters behind him, and he felt the architecture of his certainty, the structure he had built across 16 years, the foundation he had never questioned because questioning it would undermine everything built on top of it. Shift. Not collapse, not shatter, shift. The way a building shifts when the ground beneath it moves by a single millimeter. Not enough to bring down walls, not enough to crack ceilings, but enough to make every door in the structure hang differently in its frame. Enough to make every straight line feel slightly, indefinably, permanently suspect. "I need to verify the file," he said. "I know you do. That is why you designed it this way. 7 months ago, when your memory was still your own, you understood exactly what they would do and exactly what you would need afterward. You knew the first thing the compromised version of yourself would want was proof that the investigation was real. Not digital proof. They demonstrated that digital records could be altered. Not witness testimony alone. Testimony from a tertiary witness could be softened the same way yours was. Physical proof. A piece of your own body, sitting in a jar, bearing your own mark, in a container sealed under your own biometric authentication. Something that exists completely outside the system they control. Something that cannot be updated, cannot self-verify, cannot be gradually rewritten to match a more convenient version of reality. A piece of yourself that proves you were real when you did the thing you can no longer remember doing. The operators will know I have accessed the evidence container," Kalen said. "Your biometric entry was logged the moment you opened the seal this morning. The container is monitored, it would be, given what it holds. They will have seen the access notification. They will be assessing response options. Then we have limited time." You had limited time 7 months ago. That is why you built a system that would function without you. The tooth is the trigger, finding it was designed to bring you here to me, to the chip, to the filing. I am the witness whose testimony cannot be softened. The chip is the evidence archive you maintained on physical media. The filing target is the capital case hard archive, the engraved stone repository that the Tertiary judiciary built specifically because the Tertiary, at some point in their civilizational history, understood that any evidence stored in a medium susceptible to modification is evidence that can eventually be corrupted. And if the names in the file are wrong, the question escaped before his discipline could contain it, not the phrasing of a trained investigator examining a hypothesis, but the raw, unprocessed sound of a man who could feel the floor tilting and could not make it level. If my investigation, the one I do not remember, contained errors. If my certainty then was already compromised before I. Stop, one syllable, flat, precise, delivered with the economy of someone who had been warned, perhaps by a version of him that could still remember giving the warning, that this question would arrive at this exact point, wearing this exact shape, and needed to be identified for what it was before it could complete its work. That is the weapon. What you are feeling right now, the question, the uncertainty, the suspicion that your own investigation might be flawed, is the product they installed. It is manufactured doubt, delivered through the same cognitive influence system your file documents, and its purpose is to make you stand exactly where you are standing, holding the evidence in your hands and hesitate. The daylight from the windows had not changed. The building had not moved. His hands holding the datapad were steady. The tooth, on its shelf in the evidence room, was unchanged, a small hard shape in a small glass jar, bearing a glyph he had chosen 16 years ago and could not remember etching into the glass 4 months ago. And the doubt was there, not as an absence of evidence. He had the evidence, 47 pages, authenticated, structured in his own methodology, supported by physical material that existed outside the compromised system. Not as a logical objection. The logic was internally consistent, procedurally sound, verified at every step by the kind of cross-reference documentation his training had spent 16 years teaching him to produce and to recognize. The doubt was there as a texture, a quality of experience, a subtle wrongness in the way his own thoughts felt when he turned them over and examined them, as though his cognitive architecture had been tuned, very slightly, to a frequency that made every conclusion feel provisional, and every certainty feel borrowed from a version of himself he could no longer access. The way a note sounds wrong when the instrument is tuned a quarter step flat, not enough to identify without a reference pitch, not enough to correct without external calibration, but enough to make every chord built on that note carry a faint, persistent dissonance that the ear registers without being able to name. He could feel the doubt. He could identify it as manufactured. He could trace its mechanism to the system described in his own file. He could understand, with the full analytical power of 16 years of investigative practice, that the uncertainty sitting in his mind was not organically his, that it had been placed there by the people the file named, using the technology the file documented, for the specific purpose of preventing him from doing what he was about to do. And none of that knowledge made it go away. Because the doubt did not live in his analysis. It lived behind his analysis, in the felt sense of what it was like to think his own thoughts, the qualitative experience of certainty itself, the way a fact was supposed to feel when you held it, the way a conclusion was supposed to settle when the evidence supported it, the specific cognitive weight that separated I know this from I have been told this. That weight had been altered. The calibration had been shifted. And no amount of evidence, however well documented, however physically anchored, however independent of the corrupted system, could reach into that space and repair what had been damaged there. Evidence could prove. It could not make you feel the proof. Sable Kincaid watched him. She did not speak. She did not offer reassurance or encouragement or the human gesture of reaching out to touch someone's arm that he had observed in other cross-species interactions, and had always found more startling than comforting. She sat in the bright room with the plateau sun coming through the glass, and she waited, with a patience that was not gentle and not kind, but simply present, the patience of a person who understood that the decision being made in front of her was not a decision about evidence or procedure or institutional risk. It was a decision about whether a mind that had been taught to doubt itself could still choose to act. Kalen looked at the datapad, his own words in his own notation, structured in his own methodology, authenticated with his own codes. 47 pages of work he could not remember performing, his own case mark on the jar, his own tooth on the shelf, hard and unchanged and carrying no memory at all, offering nothing except the mute mineral fact of its own existence. A thing that could not doubt itself because it had never possessed the capacity for doubt. A thing that was what it was, completely and permanently, without reference to any baseline, without verification against any system, without the possibility of drift. "You told me something 7 months ago," Sable said quietly. "The day you arranged the extraction. You said you chose a tooth because it was the hardest part of the body, harder than bone, the last biological tissue to decay. The one part of a person that outlasts every soft structure, every neural pathway, every synaptic connection, every memory trace that the brain holds in patterns of electrical potential and chemical gradient. You said, memories are the softest things we have. They rewrite themselves every time we access them. They change with a word, a suggestion, a feeling. A tooth is the opposite. It sits in the jaw and it does not change. It does not update. It does not adjust itself to match what the system expects it to be. It is the one part of the body that is already stone." He heard the words. He did not remember saying them. He could not feel the memory of saying them, no weight, no texture, no anchoring sensory detail. Just the description. Just the words, reported to him by someone whose mind could not have been altered to report them falsely, carrying the authority of a witness he had chosen specifically for her immunity to the weapon being used against him. He closed the case file on the datapad, opened the judiciary's capital case filing interface, the system reserved for cases involving charges against tertiary officials at the level of senior judicial authority, cases whose evidence was transcribed into the hard archive under protocols that had not changed in 400 years. He entered his biometric authentication. The system read his hand geometry, his retinal pattern, the specific electrical signature of his neural architecture. The same architecture that had been damaged, the same hands that had placed the tooth in the jar. The interface asked for his case mark. He drew it on the screen with one finger. The same angles, the same curves, the symbol he had chosen at 22 years old and had written 10,000 times since, in every file, on every tag, on the inside surface of a glass jar, by a version of himself that existed now only in someone else's testimony. The system accepted it. "Filing," he said. He pressed the authentication key. The file entered the capital case hard archive, the engraved stone repository, the system the tertiary had built from mineral and metal specifically because mineral and metal did not update, did not self-verify, did not drift. 47 pages of an investigation, invisible to him for 4 months, became part of the permanent judicial record of Veen Reach. The engraving process would take 6 hours. Stone cutters, working in the sealed vault beneath the judiciary complex, would transcribe every word into plates of compressed basite, the dense, dark stone quarried from the northern mountains of the tertiary homeworld, chosen for its hardness, its resistance to erosion, and its absolute indifference to the passage of time and the opinions of the people who handled it. When the process was finished, the evidence would exist in a medium that could not be softened, could not be blurred, could not be gradually adjusted to match a version of reality that someone found more comfortable. It would sit in the vault the way the tooth sat in the jar, permanent, unchanged, uninterested in whether anyone remembered putting it there. Sable Kincaid stood from her terminal. She picked up a second data chip from her desk drawer, a redundant copy, a backup maintained with the reflexive caution of a species that had spent thousands of years learning, through catastrophe and loss, not to trust any single repository to preserve the truth. She placed it in the inner pocket of her jacket and sealed the pocket's fastener with the practiced economy of a gesture performed many times. "They will come for you," she said. "Within the hour, possibly sooner. The filing notification is automatic. The operators will see the case number and the charges, and they will understand that the system they built has failed in the specific way they designed it to be immune to failure." "I understand." "The doubt will not go away, even after the filing, even after the engraving. The resonance damage to your cognitive architecture is permanent, or at least, no therapeutic protocol currently exists that can reverse it. You will feel uncertain about this case for the rest of your career. Every time you access the file, every time someone asks you about the investigation, every time you stand in a room and try to remember conducting it, you will feel the doubt. You will question whether the names are correct, whether the evidence was read accurately, whether the investigator who wrote those 47 pages was thinking clearly. That doubt will be with you permanently, and it will feel real, and the feeling will be a lie, and knowing that it is a lie will not make the feeling stop." "I understand." "And you filed it anyway." Kalen Dreth, tertiary investigator, 16 years certified, stood in the bright consulting wing of the Veen Reach Judiciary Complex with the plateau sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the white city stretching sharp and clean to the horizon. And he held the datapad in his hands, and he felt the doubt sitting in his mind like a foreign object embedded in living tissue, present, identifiable, mapped by every diagnostic instrument he possessed, and permanent. "The tooth does not ask whether it is real," he said. "It does not verify itself against a baseline. It does not drift. It sits in the bone, and it is what it is, and what it is does not depend on what the tooth thinks about itself." He paused. The daylight on the floor had shifted a fraction of a degree. Beneath his feet in the sealed vault, the stone cutters had begun their work. His own words, written by a version of himself he could no longer remember being, were being carved into rock by hands that would not ask whether the words were true. "I cannot be the tooth. I am the soft thing. The thing that changes, the thing that can be rewritten, the thing whose certainty depends on architecture that someone else has learned to reach into. But I can put the evidence where it becomes the tooth, where it sits in the stone and does not change, regardless of what I remember or forget or doubt, or what they have done to the part of me that was supposed to be the foundation." She watched him, the human gaze direct, steady, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with witness. The act of being seen by a mind that could not be altered to unsee. "You designed this," she said. 7 months ago, every component, the extraction, the jar, the glyph, the chip, the filing target, the choice of a human witness. You sat in this room and you built a system to carry your investigation past the point where your own mind could no longer be trusted to carry it. You treated your future self, the person standing in this room right now, feeling the doubt right now, as a compromised witness, and you constructed the case so that the truth of it did not depend on that witness's ability to feel certain. That is good investigative methodology, Kalen said. You design the evidentiary chain so that it does not depend on any single point of failure. And you are the single point of failure. I have always been the single point of failure. Every investigator is. We are the instruments through which evidence is observed, interpreted, and presented, and instruments can be miscalibrated. The only difference is that, until 4 months ago, I did not know that someone had found a way to miscalibrate this particular instrument, without the instrument detecting the change. He turned and looked down the corridor toward the evidence room. The door was sealed. Behind it, on a shelf in a jar behind glass, resting on a square of white cloth, a small hard piece of himself sat in the light, unchanged, unchangeable, the hardest part of a body placed beyond the reach of the softest weapon. It would be there tomorrow. It would be there in a year. It would be there when the engraving was complete, and the case was filed, and the operators were named, and the judiciary launched the internal investigation that would consume months of institutional energy and require the cognitive integrity of every participating investigator to be independently verified before their findings could be accepted. A recursive cascade of verification, and doubt that the architects of the corruption had almost certainly anticipated and built into their calculus of acceptable risk. The tooth would outlast all of it. It would sit in the jar, and it would not update, and it would not drift, and it would not soften, and it would not, under any circumstances, wonder whether it was real. Kalen turned from the corridor. He walked toward the filing office, carrying the case in his hands, feeling the doubt in his mind like a permanent weather pattern, present, accounted for, factored into every decision, not as a guide but as an obstacle, a known contaminant in the instrument's readings that could be compensated for but never removed. Choosing not with certainty, not with the bedrock conviction that his training had promised and his career had delivered for 16 years before it was taken from him, but with the specific, deliberate, irreducible act of choosing when certainty is no longer available, to treat the evidence as though it mattered more than the feeling. The filing office was 3 corridors away. He walked the distance in silence, past the intake window where the clerk had flagged his cognitive anomaly report 2 hours ago, past the atrium where the prismatic ceiling panels scattered the 19-hour sun into ribbons of spectral color across the white stone floor, past the entrance to the evidence wing where a tooth that had once been part of his jaw sat in a jar on a shelf, bearing his mark, carrying his intention, holding his investigation in a medium that could not be corrupted by the same weapon that had corrupted him. The filing officer accepted the case without comment. She was a young tertiary, barely 3 years certified, still carrying the precise, slightly rigid posture of someone who followed procedure because procedure was still new enough to require conscious effort rather than habit. She processed the biometric authentication, verified the case mark, confirmed the capital case designation, and initiated the transfer to the engraving queue. Her hands moved with competent, unhesitating efficiency. She did not ask what the case contained. She did not read the charges. She did not look up from her terminal with the expression of someone who had just processed a filing that would dismantle the careers of senior officials she walked past every morning in the atrium. She simply did her job with the institutional faith of a person who trusted that the systems she served were designed to produce justice. And the small, quiet, devastating irony of that trust was something Kalen registered and cataloged and set aside, because irony was a luxury, and he was operating on the stripped-down procedural minimum of a mind that could no longer afford luxuries. The filing was confirmed. The engraving queue accepted the transfer. Somewhere beneath the building, in the sealed vault where the hard archive lived, the stone cutters were being prepared, ancient machines, maintained for centuries, their function unchanged since the earliest days of the tertiary judicial system. They would carve his words into basite with the patient, indifferent precision of instruments that had never been asked to evaluate the truth of what they transcribed. They carved. The stone held. The words endured. That was the entire system. No self-verification. No baseline drift. No quarterly automated audits confirming that the engraving matched what the engraving expected itself to say. Just marks in stone, permanent and unaware of their own permanence. He walked out of the filing office and stood in the corridor. The case was filed. The evidence was entering stone. The investigation, his investigation, conducted by his mind, documented in his methodology, authenticated with his mark, was passing from the jurisdiction of memory into the jurisdiction of mineral. From the softest medium to the hardest. From the thing that could be changed by a resonance pattern to the thing that could only be changed by a chisel. The doubt was still there. It would always be there. He understood that now with the clinical clarity of a patient who has received a permanent diagnosis and has moved past the stage of hoping it might be temporary. The doubt was a scar in his cognitive architecture, a place where the calibration had been shifted and could not be shifted back, and he would carry it for the rest of his professional life, the way a soldier carries a piece of shrapnel too close to the spine to remove, not forgotten, not accepted, simply accounted for and compensated around. But the evidence was in stone, and the tooth was in the jar. And somewhere in this bright building, in offices he had walked past for 16 years, the operators were learning that the system they had built to protect themselves, the elegant, invisible, therapeutically derived architecture of manufactured doubt, had failed against the oldest countermeasure in the history of evidence. A piece of the physical world, placed beyond the reach of the mind, carrying a truth that did not require belief to remain true. Behind him, the sun continued its slow 19-hour arc across the bright sky of Veen Reach, illuminating everything equally, the true and the fabricated, the remembered and the softened, the permanent and the compromised, patient, democratic and casting no shadows deep enough to hide in.